December 17, 1945. The western zones of occupied Germany. Snow fell slowly through the broken skeleton of what had once been Frankfurt, each flake landing soundlessly on rubble that still smelled faintly of ash and cordite. In the dim light of a December afternoon that arrived too early and departed too soon, a line of women stood outside a temporary distribution center, their breath forming small clouds in the frozen air. They wore coats that had been mended too many times, scarves wrapped tight against a cold that came not just from the winter wind, but from somewhere deeper, somewhere no wool could reach. Their hands, raw and red, clutched empty baskets and cloth bags. Behind them, children pressed close to their mothers' legs, silent in the way children become when hunger has taught them that crying changes nothing. The women did not speak much to one another. They simply waited, as they had learned to wait for everything in this first winter of peace that felt nothing like peace at all. The war had ended 7 months earlier, but Germany had not stopped dying. In the spring of 1945, when the Wehrmacht finally collapsed and Hitler's Reich disintegrated into rubble and refugees, the German people had believed that suffering would end with the guns falling silent. They had been wrong. What followed was not liberation, but a descent into a hunger that moved through the population like a slow plague. The Allied occupation zones divided Germany into administrative sections, but hunger recognized no such boundaries. By December 1945, the official ration for German civilians in the American and British zones had been reduced to between 1,000 and 1,200 calories per day, roughly half of what the human body requires to maintain basic function. A Senate hearing in June 1946 would later confirm these figures with bureaucratic precision, the numbers typed neatly on official documents that could not convey what 1,000 calories actually meant in the hollow of a child's cheek or the trembling of a woman's hands. The winter of 1945 into 1946 became known among Germans as the Hunger Winter. The Hunger Winter, though that term hardly captured the scope of what transpired. The Nazi food distribution system, which had sustained the population through years of total war by extracting resources from occupied territories, had completely collapsed. No food came from the East anymore, no grain from Ukraine, no livestock from Poland. The transportation infrastructure that had moved supplies across Germany lay in ruins. Thousands of rail lines twisted and broken. Bridges dropped into rivers they had once spanned. In cities like Hamburg and Berlin, Cologne and Munich, women picked through rubble looking for anything edible, anything at all. They boiled grass and tree bark. They made soup from bones that had already been boiled twice before. In March 1946, the British would be forced to reduce rations further still to 1,000 calories or less, a level that medical experts recognized as a form of slow starvation. The German food energy intake during this period, measured scientifically and recorded in reports filed away in government archives, revealed a population that was not recovering from war, but continuing to die from it, one malnourished body at a time. The German civilian population, particularly the women, had expected occupation. They had heard the broadcasts, seen the newsreels before the electricity stopped working. They knew the Americans and British were coming. What they had not expected, what they could not have imagined during those last desperate months of the Third Reich, when propaganda still promised miracle weapons and final victories, was the sheer abundance that would arrive with the Allied forces. German women who had spent years managing ration cards that entitled each person to a piece of bread the size of a fist, who had learned to make entire meals from potato peels and turnip greens, who had forgotten what it meant to feel fully satisfied after eating. These women were not prepared for what they saw when American soldiers unpacked their rations. They were not prepared for the reality of an enemy that did not know hunger, that had never known hunger, that came from a place where hunger itself seemed to have been abolished entirely. American soldiers in Germany carried K rations and C rations, compact meals designed to sustain combat troops in the field. Each K ration contained not just sustenance, but abundance of a kind that seemed incomprehensible to German observers. There were crackers and cheese, canned meat and chocolate, instant coffee and sugar tablets, cigarettes and chewing gum. The chocolate bars alone, produced by Hershey's under contract with the U.S. Army, represented more calories than many German families saw in a day. The Ration D bar, that dense brick of chocolate that American GIs joked about, calling it barely edible and complaining that it tasted only slightly better than a boiled potato, contained enough energy to keep a soldier functioning through hours of combat. To German children who had not tasted chocolate in years, who barely remembered what chocolate was, these bars were not rations at all, but miracles wrapped in brown paper. The C rations were even more elaborate. Tin cans that opened to reveal entire meals, beans and franks, meat and vegetable stew, ham and eggs, food that was not just filling but flavored, seasoned, made to be enjoyed rather than merely endured. American soldiers complained about these rations, traded them, left them half-eaten. They did not understand, could not understand, what it meant to German women who watched them casually discard food that could have kept a family alive for days. The non-fraternization policy, established by military command in the spring of 1945, had explicitly forbidden American soldiers from socializing with German civilians. The orders were clear and unambiguous. No handshakes, no conversation, no sharing of food or supplies. The policy was designed to impress upon the German population their collective guilt, to ensure they understood that defeat carried consequences. Do not fraternize, the orientation booklets told incoming soldiers. The German people must learn what they have brought upon themselves. For the first months of occupation, many soldiers followed these rules, maintaining the cold distance that military discipline demanded. But by winter, as the weather turned and the desperation of the German population became impossible to ignore, something began to shift. Soldiers stationed in small German towns saw the same faces every day, the same children with their hollow eyes, the same women who moved through the streets like ghosts of themselves. The policy did not change officially, but its enforcement became inconsistent, arbitrary, dependent on the conscience of individual soldiers and the willingness of officers to look the other way. Christmas approached with its particular weight of tradition and memory. For American soldiers far from home, the holiday carried associations of warmth and plenty. Family tables laden with turkey and ham, pies and cakes, the abundance of an American Christmas that persisted even during wartime, because America itself had never been touched by the destruction that consumed Europe. The military made efforts to give soldiers stationed in Germany something approximating a traditional Christmas dinner. Special rations supplemented with whatever could be procured locally or shipped from American supply depots. There were cookies and candy, chocolate bars and oranges, coffee and sugar in quantities that seemed extravagant, even by American standards. The soldiers, most of them young men barely 20 years old, found themselves in possession of more food than they could possibly consume, surrounded by a population that had almost nothing. What happened in those December days of 1945 was not the result of official policy or military directive. It was not organized or sanctioned. It began with individual choices, small acts of shared humanity that spread from one soldier to another, from one town to the next, like warmth returning to frozen ground. An American sergeant in a small town near Bad Kreuznach watched children standing by the road as his convoy passed, their faces thin and pale in the winter light, their clothes insufficient against the cold. He reached into his pack and threw them chocolate bars, watched them scramble to collect the wrapped treasures from the snow. A group of soldiers stationed in Wiesbaden, seeing German children outside their base with empty lunch boxes, began saving portions of their rations to distribute through local schools. They did this quietly, without permission, knowing that if their officers noticed, they might be ordered to stop. In Frankfurt, A young private from Iowa found himself walking past a line of German women waiting for their ration cards to be processed, saw a child no older than his younger sister back home, and made a decision that violated every regulation he had been taught. He opened his pack and began handing out sea rations, 1 can to each woman who held a child. The German women who received these offerings did not react the way the soldiers expected. They did not smile or express gratitude in the cheerful way Americans associated with gift-giving. Instead, something broke in them, some final barrier of pride and endurance that had carried them through the war and the months after. They took the food with trembling hands and then they cried. They stood in the cold street or in the doorway of the distribution center, holding cans of ham and eggs or chocolate bars wrapped in brown paper, and they wept. Some of them wept silently, tears cutting tracks down faces that were thinner than faces should be, their shoulders shaking with the effort of keeping silent. Others cried aloud, harsh sobs that sounded like something. The chocolate bar became, in those winter weeks, a symbol of something larger than its own small substance. It was not just food, though it was certainly that. It was evidence of a system so wealthy, so productive, so fundamentally different from anything Germans had experienced that it could afford to package chocolate for soldiers, to include candy and gum and coffee in rations designed for men at war. The Hershey bars that American GIs handed to German children represented an abundance that was not the result of conquest or extraction, not the product of territories occupied and populations enslaved, but the output of an economy that functioned on principles Germany had never understood. Americans, even in wartime, even when rationing restricted civilian consumption, had never experienced the kind of hunger that Germans now endured. The soldiers who gave away their chocolate did so casually, without sacrifice, because they knew more chocolate would come, that the supply was endless, that America itself was a place where hunger had been solved as a technical problem, rather than accepted as a permanent condition of human existence. For German women who had spent years managing scarcity, calculating how to divide insufficient food among too many mouths, the casual abundance of American rations was a revelation about the nature of the society that had defeated them. Historical records from the period, buried in military reports and occupation authority documents, confirm what individual memoirs and testimonies suggest. By late 1945 and early 1946, despite official policies restricting fraternization and prohibiting the sharing of military rations with German civilians, American soldiers were systematically violating these regulations. Officers often looked the other way, understanding that strict enforcement would require punishing men for basic acts of charity. In some areas, the distribution of food to German children became semi-official, with military chaplains organizing programs to provide meals through schools and churches, using the legal fiction that this was humanitarian aid rather than fraternization. The distinction was meaningless to the women who stood in line for their ration cards and found, on certain days, that American soldiers had supplemented the official allotment with cans from their own supplies. The distinction was meaningless to the children who learned to recognize American uniforms not as symbols of occupation, but as signals that chocolate might be available if they waved enthusiastically enough. The policy began to change officially in early 1946, though the change came slowly and through bureaucratic channels that seemed designed to obscure what was actually happening. President Truman, responding to reports of mass starvation and facing pressure from American humanitarian organizations, began to authorize food shipments to Germany beyond what military necessity required. The restrictions on care packages eased, allowing American civilians to send food parcels to German families. The military government in the American zone gradually increased calorie allotments, though it would take until 1948 and the implementation of the Marshall Plan before German food supplies reached anything approaching adequacy. These policy changes, announced in measured official language and implemented through administrative procedures, obscured the fact that they were responses to a reality that had already been created on the ground by soldiers who could not watch children starve and do nothing. For German women, the experience of receiving food from American soldiers became a kind of education in the difference between democratic and totalitarian systems, though it was an education delivered not through lectures or political speeches, but through the simple medium of chocolate and canned meat. The Nazi regime, which had promised to provide for the German people as part of its vision of racial solidarity and national strength, had left them to starve when it collapsed. The American government, representing a nation that Germans had been taught to despise as weak and decadent, had sent soldiers who could not help feeding their enemies' children. The lesson was clear even if it was rarely stated explicitly. Democracy produced abundance. Dictatorship produced hunger. Freedom created systems that could afford generosity even toward the defeated. Totalitarianism created systems that consumed everything and left nothing but ruins and empty bellies when they finally fell. The memory of that first winter of occupation, of American soldiers sharing Christmas rations with German women and children, became for many Germans a kind of founding myth of the post-war relationship between the two nations. It was not the only thing that shaped that relationship, not the only factor that turned occupied Germany from enemy territory into a Cold War ally within a few short years. But it mattered in ways that official policy and strategic calculations could not. The women who had cried while holding cans of American stew told their children and grandchildren about those days. They spoke of the kindness shown by young men who had no obligation to be kind, who had been told explicitly not to be kind, but who gave away chocolate and coffee because they could not watch starvation and do nothing. The children who had stood by roads waving at American convoys, who had received candy from soldiers in tanks and jeeps, grew up with a different understanding of what America meant than they might have developed from official propaganda or political education alone. They learned that abundance could be generous rather than exploitative, that power could be tempered by mercy, that the victors in war could choose to feed rather than to punish. The chocolate bar, that small brown brick wrapped in wax paper and printed with the Hershey name, became more than food in the memories of those who received it. It became a symbol of possibility, evidence that there were places in the world where hunger had been conquered, where children expected to eat every day, where adults did not have to make impossible calculations about which members of the family would receive how much of the too small ration. For children who had grown up knowing only scarcity, whose earliest memories were of ration cards and empty shelves and meals that never quite filled the hollow feeling inside. The experience of eating American chocolate was the first tangible proof that another kind of life was possible. The taste itself, sweet and rich in a way that wartime German chocolate had never been, suggested abundance as a physical sensation, sweetness that did not have to be rationed or measured or stretched to cover one more day. 77 years after that winter, men and women who had been children in occupied Germany still remembered the taste of American chocolate. They remembered standing by the road waving at convoys, remembered the excitement when a jeep actually stopped, remembered the gum and candy distributed by soldiers whose faces they could no longer recall in detail, but whose generosity had shaped their understanding of what America represented. They remembered their mothers crying, though as children they had not fully understood why. They knew their mothers were happy to have food, but they could not grasp the complexity of emotions that produced those tears. The shame and relief and grief and gratitude all mixed together in a response that was about much more than hunger satisfied. Only later, when they had children of their own and could imagine what it would mean to be unable to feed them, did they begin to understand what their mothers had felt in those moments when American soldiers violated orders to share rations with the families of their defeated enemies. The historical record of World War II is filled with battles and strategies, with decisions made in conference rooms and headquarters, with the movement of armies across maps, and the calculations of supply lines and casualty ratios. These things matter, and historians are right to study them carefully, to understand how the war was fought and won. But history is also made in smaller moments, in individual choices that violate official policy because humanity demands it, in the space between what regulations require and what conscience permits. The story of American soldiers sharing Christmas rations with German women and children in the winter of 1945 is not a major campaign or a turning point in any strategic sense. It is, instead, a small truth about how enemies become allies, how hatred transforms into something more complex, how the aftermath of war sometimes reveals possibilities that the war itself obscured. The women cried because they had expected punishment and received mercy instead. They cried because their children could eat. They cried because the ideology that had sustained them through years of war and deprivation was revealed as hollow in the simple act of sharing food. They cried because the enemy had proven more generous than their own leaders, and that revelation changed everything. How. In the years that followed, as Germany rebuilt and the Cold War transformed the occupation zones into something approaching normal nations again, the memory of that first winter persisted. The women who had stood in line with empty baskets and returned home with American rations did not forget. The children who had eaten chocolate distributed by soldiers in tanks grew up and built lives in a Germany that looked nothing like the ruined landscape of 1945. They became doctors and teachers, workers and businessmen, parents and grandparents. Many of them immigrated to America, drawn by the memory of abundance, by the promise represented in those chocolate bars handed out so casually in a time of desperation. They carried with them a gratitude that was complicated, mixed with other emotions less easy to name, but real nonetheless. They had learned, in that winter of hunger, that freedom and abundance were not separate things but deeply connected, that the system which produced endless chocolate bars also produced the soldiers who gave them away without asking for anything in return. The story of those women crying in the winter of 1945, clutching cans of American food in their raw and reddened hands, is ultimately a story about what happens when ideology confronts reality. When propaganda meets the stubborn persistence of human kindness, it is a story about chocolate bars and their meaning, about how something small can carry the weight of something much larger, about how generosity in a time of hunger can reshape understanding in ways that speeches and policies never could. It is a story about the moment when enemies stopped being abstractions and became people, about the choice to share food when regulations said you should not, about crying not just from relief, but from the terrible recognition that everything you had believed was false and the truth was more complicated and more painful and more hopeful than the lies had ever been. And in the end, perhaps, it is a story about abundance itself, about what it means to live in a system that produces enough that its soldiers can casually give away chocolate bars to the children of their defeated enemies, about the moral choices that abundance makes possible and the kind of peace that generosity can create. The women cried in that December cold because they were hungry, and the Americans fed them, yes, but they cried also because they understood in that moment of receiving that they had lost more than the war. They had lost years to a lie about what strength meant and what victory required, about who was worthy and who was not, about how societies should organize themselves and what values should guide them. And in the rubble of that loss, in the ashes of a 1,000-year Reich that lasted only 12, they found American soldiers handing out chocolate bars and canned stew, acting out of simple human decency in violation of military orders, creating the possibility of something different than what had come before. That possibility tasted like chocolate. It tasted like sweetness, returning to a world that had forgotten sweetness. It tasted like hope, and that is why the women cried, holding those small brown bars in their hands like prayers answered by an enemy who had somehow become something else entirely.